Welcome back to the We The Patriots podcast. I am your host, Sal Assante, and today will be part 2 of our series on the interesting congruencies between Rome and the United States and the rise in executive power in both. Again, I'm your host, Sal Assante. Let's get right into it. I already recorded this episode, and not gonna lie, I was not happy with the way the first one came out because, well, it was set for Friday. I was really hoping to get it done, and I ended up on a 40-minute spiel about essentially Roman emperors and the history of all of them, and that's not what I want to do today. I don't want to sidetrack that far. What we're going to try to do today is focus in on highlight the large changes when it comes to the executive branch of the United States, who the figures were that enacted those changes, and just how detrimental it might be for the future of the United States. Looking back again on the history, if you haven't caught part 1, you should probably go listen to it. Part 2 here, we're just going to be kind of breaking down again the American point of view a lot more. If you recall back, we had many different, three different kinds of government that the Roman Empire, as we like to look at it today, actually went through. That was a kingship, then a republic, and finally an empire. Where we're at here in America in comparing this is we are an empire stage. I already mentioned this in part 1, but when you reach empire stage, like we are very often called on international media by other countries and even by some of our own media and here internally in the United States, what you're looking at is a very impactful, we'll say, executive branch. And where did that all start? Well, first I want to take a little bit of a look back to Rome. Some of the examples that were set by Roman emperors, first starting with Augustus. This is where many historians like to claim that the beginning of the empire started. I already mentioned this in part 1, but to me it actually really starts underneath the previous Julius Caesar. And as it gets handed down, as the empire gets handed down to Augustus Caesar, you start to see rule by one man, autocratic government, if you will. And the highlight, of course, if you're going to talk about Augustus, is going to be his Praetorian Guard. Very similar today to our Secret Service in an interesting way. Secret Service, of course, is pertaining to a lot of different people, some of them not even necessarily intertwined with the executive branch, or at least not anymore. It's kind of gross. But the Praetorian Guard kind of set the emperor aside as a different kind of person, almost a godlike figure in comparison to even the Senate. Right? And then you started to see a slow devolution of what was once the Great Republic, right? The Republic of Rome, by rule of people like Caligula, Nero, Domitian. Definitely didn't say that right. But essentially overseeing massive mismanagement of the financial system in Rome, which we've witnessed many times here in the United States. Whether you're going to blame that on the president or not is another thing, but calling that out is important. And then, of course, you have somebody like Commodus, who is pretty much purely famous for his neglect on the policy that he was supposed to be enacting. And as you start to see the empire unfold after the 200s AD or CE, depending on what version you want to use today, you start to see people like Diocletian, Constantine, Theodosius, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the official ending of the Empire of Rome in the West, anyway, is under Theodosius. A lot of this really came down to inability to perform military actions to defend the land that the broad swath of the Roman Empire was trying to protect. And at the end of the day, once you started seeing massive pieces of land being taken by foreign powers, whether it be Germanics or Muslims coming in from the Middle East, you started to see the entire empire start to collapse. Now, where I see this in comparison with where we're at here in the United States is it's not a direct one-to-one comparison. So for anybody who might have heard that we're essentially mirroring the image of a fallen Rome, I don't think that's necessarily the case. Let me lay out why. Number one, neither of our branches of government that you're talking about, other than the executive, judiciary, or the legislative branches, neither of them have been impacted that much Technically, we still have power in the legislative in order to call for war, in order to declare war. Now, that has been, as we'll talk about in a little bit, kind of diminished, but still, in all technicality and in the written law, they are the only body that can declare war. That's a pretty important fact. Now, as I've mentioned in the last episode, in the creation of the United States and why the United States became what it was, especially in the institution of a constitution, it took a lot to get there. And a lot of the reasoning, especially used in the Federalist Papers, which were popularized very much after the ratification of the Constitution. With all that being bared in mind, a lot of it was kind of push in a lot of ways how we see policy being made today, and that's through an emergency or emergencies. One of the biggest things that is called to and is alluded to in the Constitutional Congress and in the making of said Constitutional Bill of Rights, a lot of it came from something like Shays Rebellion or similar incidents that may have occurred with not being able to pay soldiers was a lot of it, not being able to get the funds in order to pay foreign debts, whether it be to France, Spain, countries. And of course, you have a couple of problems there. Number one, an unhappy military can easily become a military looking to seize power. There was a lot of threats of that in the early United States. And not only that, when you can't pay debts, you risk other nations coming in and attempting to come in and possibly force the issue of either repayment or paying by giving up land. And a lot of this, of course, stems down to the fact that our government had no ability to levy taxes on citizens. Without an ability to levy taxes, you can't really fix many problems, whether it comes to militarily, or whether you're talking about just a function of government, something that we think of simply today, firefighting, police work, road work, building infrastructure. All these different things require money, and in order to get money, of course, as a government, you need to be able to levy taxes. And without an ability to levy taxes, our government was kind of impotent. Hence, the need for something like a constitution, and that is how we got where we're at. Now, with that institution of a constitution, creating an executive in the United States, whereas previously under the Articles of Confederation, it was essentially one vote cast per state, no difference based on population whatsoever. There was no upper and lower chamber of Congress. It was just a Congress. You run into a lot of problems, like we kind of mentioned in the first episode, where states wouldn't really be interested in helping out other states, even if it was something as big as a rebellion. They didn't really care. They didn't really have any reason to care because it wasn't directly affecting them. When I say them, I'm talking about other states. The executive and allowing a federal government to be imposed allows for a truly united states, whereas previously under the Articles of Confederation, you had a confederacy or really a band of states that were, when you say states, talking about what was under the Article of Confederation, you're really talking about sovereign countries, technically. And that's how every one of them viewed themselves. And it took a lot of convincing to get these delegates bought into the fact that we needed an overseeing federal government. Now, as the executive starts getting created, and of course, our first president, who, not mistaken, took over in 1790, but I will check that. 1789, my apologies, 1789. Taking over was George Washington for the first time. You started to see, by way of either his writings or the way that policy was enacted underneath Washington's first presidency, you started to see how more and more it was going to be required in order to enact very impactful policy, or policy that was needed in the moment was going to have to be directed by the executive and not by Congress. A lot of what we hear today still complains about how Congress is slow moving. They don't really get anything done, do a whole lot of talking. This has always been the case, and it was one of the reasons that even George Washington himself got frustrated with Congress, was the fact that they were very slow to act, and a lot of times with a whole lot of talk and not a lot of doing. And that's where we kind of see ourselves in a way today. Now, the only problem is that the executive, as we're going to talk about a little bit here coming up, the executive has assumed a lot of different roles that may not have been outlined in the Constitution. This is where we might be seeing some problems going forward. where I want to start today is, that was a lengthy intro, but where I want to start today is the different amount of executive orders and seeing the difference in here going over time. We're going to start here with Abraham Lincoln, where I think is the really a good place to start when you're talking about an expansion in the executive power of the United States. The reason that I say that is uh, really doesn't really matter unless you're arguing from a straw man point of view, or you really think that for example, when it comes to the Civil War, that slavery was the only issue. Um, a lot of terms, it definitely was not. A lot of argument can be made that it was heavily revolving around state rights themselves, ability of states to govern themselves as they see fit, and something like an action like the Emancipation Proclamation or the suspension of habeas corpus, both orders done under Abraham Lincoln, can be viewed as massive, and I would view it as a massive undertaking by the executive to take more power away from Congress. Now, when you look at the numbers, I'm not going to go over every single president here, but just for an example, this is including executive orders, proclamations, and memoranda. Now, executive orders are direct actions being written out by the President of the United States. Memoranda is a less formal type of directive from the United States, and something like a proclamation is an official announcement, essentially levying a direct way of interpreting either law that is existing or the way that law should be. Just so we have that clear. So that is what is all going into the numbers that make up executive actions. It's not just executive orders, but so we have an idea where we're starting here. Abraham Lincoln and many following him, well, not many actually, just Andrew Johnson, is somewhere around the range of the low 100s. 113 for himself. Given that memoranda wasn't a thing, maybe you're missing out on some here that could have been interpreted as such. Then you jump up to all the way up to around 400 under Ulysses S. Grant. And that was a pretty significant amount. The next significant jump is going to be under Theodore Roosevelt. If you recall different actions taken by Theodore Roosevelt, what I want you to think about is trust busting, number one. If you don't remember trust busting is the action that our government can take when it sees that possibly a company has overtaken almost cornered the market in a certain way or a certain market. One of the best examples, of course, would be Standard Oil back in the day underneath Theodore Roosevelt. And you had a lot of actions taken in this and also with national parks. So something that could be argued was a very good thing. And as we'll discuss later, the actual cost to the government wasn't really all that high and definitely not a big jump. So it's impressive that the amount of actions taken, somewhere around 1,300, such a big jump from what had previously kind of been made precedent, like low 100s, all the way up to 400 under Grant, but 1,300 was astronomical. And then heading up all the way up to about 2,000 under Woodrow Wilson. These are pretty significant numbers. Now, we're going to see more and more these numbers just start to climb. Now, under FDR, you have a little bit of a different situation because he, of course, was around for so much longer, being the only president that actually established himself for more than 2 terms and being there for 3.5, I want to say, if I'm being correct. He had actually about 5,000 executive orders. And remember, of course, he's also overseeing a lot of not only depression recovery, but also a lot of time under World War II. So a lot of executive actions had to be taken, or at least supporters would say so. Truman, under his two terms, actually brought it back down to around 1,400. Eisenhower continued at around the same rate, even though he's on term at around 850. John F. Kennedy, only being alive for about 2 years in his term, got out 381. He actually massively decreased the rate. If he was alive for his entire term, you would guess that he'd be somewhere around 650, 700 range of executive actions taken. Lyndon Johnson bumped it right back up to about 800. Richard Nixon also around 800. Gerald Ford actually lowered the number again down to around 400. Then you have Carter, Reagan, H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, all roughly keeping something around the 700 to 800 range. So that became kind of precedent, even down from those major numbers that we saw from someone like Theodore Roosevelt. George W. Bush continued that at around 900, and then you start to see the numbers pick back up, specifically under the last three presidents of the United States. Now, again, we're all well under those numbers displayed by FDR and as well as Theodore Roosevelt. But keep in mind that going from a precedent of somewhere around, once you got to Bill Clinton, you are in the 900s, but precedent being somewhere an average of about 800 for 2 terms, 400 for 1 term. This is where it gets a little bit crazy here. Barack Obama, over his entire presidency, laid out about 1,100 executive actions. Donald Trump, under his first term, not under 2 terms, of course, we're just beginning his second term, for his first term, laid out 1,100 executive actions, executive orders totaling around 220, proclamations being somewhere in the range of 500 and high 500s, 570, and memoranda being somewhere around 400. Just impressive numbers. And what you got to think is, as these numbers get compared, more than likely, how I would like to view it is that, because I would have to go study every single one, and I'm not doing that at this moment. Maybe we'll revisit this in the future. You got to think that Donald Trump's first term, a lot of it was spent undoing executive actions taken by Obama. Then you see Joe Biden do the same thing in reverse. 1,105 is what we're estimating here is the number from Joe Biden. Again, what I want you to understand is that both of these previous 2 presidents I mentioned, Trump and Biden, this is under 1 term, 1 4-year term. The drastic uptick in the rate of executive actions being taken by our executive is something I think to be noted. Again, I want to reiterate what I think most of this, and this is my opinion, this is not fact. What I think a lot of this is reversing what the other side would see as the damage done by the previous administration. I say damage in air quotes there because a lot of our politics has become extremely opinionated, striated to the extremes on both sides. You may view even the most common sense piece of legislation brought forth by your opponent as nonsensical or demonize it just because they're on the other side. That's become very common nowadays. And even under Obama's presidency, that was not as common. So that being said, where I see the issue, of course, is the rate of executive actions being taken. And of course, expanding upon that executive power that is given to that branch that is, again, supposed to only really be one branch of government, not the oversight. Now, when you talk about the impactful legislation that was brought down by the executive, again, I just want to start with Lincoln. The Emancipation Proclamation, suspension of habeas corpus, was a very obvious sign that things are not the same anymore. And again, you go into FDR, so the amount of social reform that was done under Franklin D. Roosevelt and the amount of different programs that we still live by today. I believe you're talking about Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. When you think about a lot of these different programs, they are long lasting. And when you think about the amount of money that has gone into these programs over time, it is, I think, where the big issue lies, is where our economy is not able to function at its highest capacity because of the amount of debt that is accruing. And we will talk about that a little bit later too to close out the show. Now, you get into someone like Truman, who used a lot of executive action to get around Congress in terms of the Korean War, putting forth his own doctrine. Lyndon Johnson with Vietnam did very much the same, and Richard Nixon trying to essentially say that there is an executive privilege by being the president of the United States and avoiding a lot of the culpabilities of his actions. You see a lot of misrepresentation of maybe what the founding fathers thought the executive should be. It was not an unimpeachable position, and in many cases there were threats of impeachment in order to get people in line. At the end of the day, Nixon did end up resigning to avoid being impeached, but we witnessed one of our own very recent presidents, that being the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, being impeached by Congress not too long ago. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, one of the biggest things to consider is the monetary. Now, I want to take a look at this before we close up here. And again, trying not to belabor all of your ears to my voice for 40 minutes talking about Rome again, which was an absolute mistake. I want to talk about the change over time in federal spending underneath different presidents. Now, What you need to keep in mind as we move forward here is as federal debts start to pile up, a lot of the spending might be going to debt service instead of actually new actions being taken. And I do think that's pretty important to keep in mind. You may be, by you, I'm saying if you were ever the president, you may be paying off your predecessor's mistakes for your entire term. And it may even be passed on to your succeeding president. And this will go on in a spiral, especially as we are not really dealing in cash anymore. When you get past, one of the biggest changes in the United States, which was the initiation of the centralized bank, the Federal Reserve, which was enacted in 1913. This was a major stepping stone in terms of us getting off of the gold standard, off of actually making sure our money had some sort of backing to it. And getting off of that standard has, well, allowed our Congress and executive to push the limits of really what we could afford. And of course, it really helped us to be major players in not only World War One, but World War Two, of course. You think about the Lend-Lease program, the amount that we were able to generate income-wise by gearing our whole economy up to center around arms production, not just for us, but selling to any and everybody who had the ability to pay. A lot of this comes from the centralization of our economic system and removing, again, that gold standard of, and when I say gold standard, that means that each and every dollar is backed up by the same amount of equivalent in a Federal Reserve. That, I believe, is one of the biggest sticking points in terms of where things have really changed in terms of today, looking back on how our founders were dealing with the system. Another thing, of course, to be considered is the amount of money that the federal government has access to, and a lot of that really centers around the federal income tax. Federal income tax was not a thing until actually the same time as a centralized bank, as that became a thing. Interestingly enough, again, it gave a lot of power to the federal government. And I'm not just saying the executive, I'm saying Congress as well. Being able to afford themselves paychecks, be able to live, yeah, that's great. Also, being able to mismanage a lot more funds because you have access to a lot more funds, that's also a very prevalent thing. Again, you don't see much of that pre-1913, but as the century of horrors to be, which would be 2 world wars, overseeing, of course, wars in Korea, war in Vietnam, a total banking failure across the world in the Great Depression. And you wonder if there's some correlation there in terms of not dealing with real hard money anymore. Now, let's get back over to what my whole point was, and that was the amount of spending that accrued under different presidents. What I want to make clear is that really from the years starting in Lincoln, of course, 61 to 65 in the 19th century, and going all the way up to about, I would say you can go all the way up to Woodrow Wilson. You have about an average of somewhere around 25 billion in today's dollars being spent federally. You have some outliers. You have someone who maybe you can say was a little more financially conscious, and that might be someone like Andrew Johnson spending only 14.5 billion in today's dollars, roughly, in his term. And then you see the outlier on the other side, someone like a Theodore Roosevelt, who spent somewhere in the ballpark of about $50 billion in today's money during his 8 years. Those are the outliers, but again, you're seeing a rolling average of somewhere around 25 billion spent under each and every president for a 4-year term. So roughly 50 billion for 2 terms. Once you get, however, to Woodrow Wilson, you see a massive increase and a steady increase in spending at the federal level. Starting with Woodrow, you are looking at somewhere in the ballpark of $241 billion in today's money. Now, what a lot of the blame there, of course, is going to be is World War One. However, that was also an opportunity for us to make a lot of money, which is what a lot of people would say if they're trying to back him up. Then you have Harding after him, who only had 2 years, if I'm not mistaken, before assassination. Let me just confirm that. I am completely wrong. He died of a heart attack. So, but only 2 years in office, he still spent $70 billion. Calvin Coolidge was a much more conservative spender. Still spent over $100 billion. Same for Hoover. Then you get to FDR, and this is the turning point. I would say, in terms of federal spending. And if you remember back, this is also where you see the biggest jump in executive orders about 5 or 10 minutes ago that we just talked about over Roosevelt's, which is astonishing. 12 years of reign, 13 years if you're including the bookends. 13 years of reign as president of the United States. Somewhere in the ballpark of $2.8 trillion in today's money is spent under his presidency. And remember, you're coming off of Coolidge at 100, Herbert Hoover at 100, up to $2.8 trillion. Now, again, what a lot of maybe pro FDR people are going to mention is that this was all taking place under the recovery from the Depression as well as under World War II, which you're not wrong. However, I think there's a pretty clear discrepancy between precedents set and what had actually ended up happening under FDR, and that is even at its highest point, about 10 times, roughly around 10 times the budget being spent. And this is all inflation adjusted, remember, so it is pretty crazy to think about. Now, Truman had 8 years, spent about 1.3, Eisenhower 1.5 in the same amount of time. John F. Kennedy, in a very short amount of time, spent about half $500 billion. And this ends up being actually precedent for quite some time. The average rolling at about $1.5 trillion per 4 years spent in office. So we get over to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, of course, spent 8 years, 2 full terms, and spent somewhere around $4.5 trillion in the federal budget. Again, this is all over his entire span of government. However, you do see a pretty big jump from the previous high of $2.5 trillion underneath FDR going to Ronald Reagan. That does end up getting pretty much copied by George H.W. Bush with only one term spending $2.1 trillion. Bill Clinton under 2 terms spending about 3.5, so really not much of an adjustment. And then you see H.W.'s son, George W. Bush, the beginning of what I would call a financial spiral. This is where we get into our modern day politic and hoping to understand that maybe we are at a place where we need to start working back to a better precedent to set going forward. Underneath George W. Bush, it's approximately $6.5 trillion spent. And again, this is all in today's dollars, so everything adjusted. It's not like Ronald Reagan spent $4.5 trillion. It's not like Franklin Delano Roosevelt spent $2.5 trillion. That money didn't really even exist back then with the United States economy. If you're talking about their dollars, when you're talking about our inflation-adjusted dollars, it absolutely did exist, and that's about how much we spent. And even in the 2000s, you would think $6.5 trillion would sink the American economy. The reason being, it's not actually $6.5 trillion. Now you go all the way up to Barack Obama, and this is where you see the first $10 trillion spender. And again, this is underneath 8 years of control of the White House. So yes, he had 2 terms, but a lot of the blame where people are going to put this on is going to be the financial crisis of 2008 that was allegedly passed down from George W. Bush. Realistically speaking, if you look at it, there's a lot of policies, and I'm not trying to claim like I'm an expert here. I'm just trying to state what I think to be obvious. There's a lot of policies, especially predatory lending, and especially when you're looking at the housing market, that kind of should have been red flags, warning signs, warning, saying that something is going to happen here. It was pretty obvious that, maybe it was Bush's doing, maybe it was under his oversight, but realistically, this is a problem brewing for quite some time here. And then you look at Donald Trump, even under 4 years, not even a whole 2 terms, what people would love to blame all of his spending on, of course, would be the tax cuts and COVID-19. With COVID-19, you have like one of those things that we love to call an emergency, a disaster, where spending is unavoidable. However, I think it's pretty common to be said, and I do agree with this point, that COVID definitely could have been handled better. And not only that, the real problem being that it seemed like Trump was not fully prepared for his first term as president. Now, the economy boomed for quite some time and even recovered from COVID quite quickly. But even with all that said, the amount of spending that went on and the amount of debt that got accrued underneath Donald Trump's first term as president was really astonishing. And that spending continued underneath Joe Biden, where in only 1 term he spent about $7.5 trillion. And again, keeping in mind that this is all inflation adjusted, if they were to have two terms, Trump would have spent somewhere around $13 trillion, really significant increase, somewhere around a 30% increase from where Biden was at spending rate. And Joe Biden has been somewhere around almost $15 trillion spent, which has been a 50% increase from where Obama was at. Again, I want you guys to keep in mind that a lot of this might be paying debt service based on your predecessors and the spending that might have gone on under them. But also a lot of this is, in my opinion, just poor financials being displayed by our chief of staff here, the head of, and what everybody would look to be the head of the United States government, being completely negligent in terms of financial responsibility is not a good look. Now, where I want to kind of get back to and explaining how this is kind of relevant. Why am I even mentioning Rome here? Well, a lot of how Rome fell apart was due to financial negligence. And not only financial negligence, but negligence in terms of duties that are owed as the official representative of a state. When I say state, I am talking about the country of the United States or the entire state of Rome. Negligence is a big factor. Here is where I kind of want to point out something that we'll talk a little bit further on in another episode coming up here soon. Negligence comes a lot when you're talking about inefficiency of government. When a government has become as large as the United States has at this point, it's not far-fetched to say that there's a lot of oversight going on. And something like a Department of Government Efficiency, the DOGE, as we are calling it now, basically the whole reason that Elon Musk is being talked about every single day politically and making a ton of money while he does it is because what he's looking into is oversights being made on basically everyone's behalf right now. The big hot button issue is the USAID, USAID that's going out to other countries and essentially looking at dismantling that whole department. And of course, this is a department overseen by the executive branch. So Trump has every ability to look at this money that's being spent. Now, why might this be a good thing? Well, I think you can already hear in the argument that I've started to build up over this entire show, and that's if you have these massive accruements of payments that are building up over presidents and presidents and presidents, and finally you get to one who's trying to be financially responsible, well, what they're going to see is a lot of oversight and the mismanaged oversight, I should say. And the mismanaged oversight at this point is everywhere. Something as simple as USAID, which makes up, I think, less than a whole percent of the federal budget. And you see just the amount of crazy spending that is going on, or even just the title of where the funds are going is absurd and abhorrent. I'll get into it again. I'll break that down in a later date. But my whole point in saying all this is that maybe there's a point to be doing all of this. Maybe we're trying to avoid a economic meltdown that did occur under something like a Roman Empire. Now, is it avoidable? Again, mentioning that the whole federal budget, when you look at USAID, it only makes up less than a percent. I think it's 0.7 or 0.8% of the entire federal budget. Is it really going to make that much of a difference? No, maybe not, but maybe it's a good place to start. And that's where I am actually very much in favor. I know I'd mentioned that Musk has no place, especially after that apparent Zig Heil that he gave, that Nazi salute. But if he's able to cut federal spending to this level, just looking at one of the smallest factors in terms of our spending, maybe as he starts to look over something like Department of Defense, our military spending, and our social welfare spending, something like a Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and all these different functions that our government now has its hand in, a lot of it since FDR, as I mentioned before, maybe this is a good thing, having some oversight here. Does it necessarily need to be Elon Musk? Maybe not, but maybe it is the right guy for the job. I'm not sure. Now, keeping in mind that I'm not a fan of what happened a couple weeks ago, I'm not a fan of throwing out Nazi salutes, of course, but not only that, the kind of people that you may be giving the wink to and saying that you're okay here, that's my problem. I would hope that Elon Musk can come out and disavow the thing that he did, even maybe if he calls it stupid or says that he was not in any way trying to do that. I don't really care, but acknowledging that it happened, I think, is pretty important because, again, if you're going to continue to work for the U.S. government and realistically put out very good findings in terms of that's how I'm viewing the things coming out of Doge right now. If that's going to continue, I'm a fan. But don't act like you're some deity. Don't act like you're some god or that your mistakes are somehow shouldn't be recognized like everybody else's. That's where I do find the fault here. But as we start to move forward again, the inability to oversee a financial system properly was one of the major downfalls of the Roman Empire. And another one was actually the oversight in terms of military operations, being unable to defend what we'd already brought up. And this is another big point that I really want to talk about, and that is, another show that we'll be doing in the future is the wrap up of the war in Israel and Gaza, Palestinians being affected, all of this. Trump came out with a quote saying that we are going to have the United States take over Gaza, which I think is pretty wholeheartedly rejected all across this country, and not only that, all across the world. However, it may have been done as leverage to get somebody else to pick up our slack here. And if that's the case, good on him, because what you're seeing is at the federal level and the spending that went into supporting Israel during this war with Palestine. And not only that, looking up north into the Russia-Ukraine war that is still ongoing to this day, the amount of money that has been poured into that war. As you can imagine, there has to be quite a bit of inefficiency there, money not going to the hands that need it. If we can clean some of this up, if we can have somebody overseeing properly this dispersal of money and making sure that it gets to the people, if we're going to spend it, it gets to the people that need it, this is going to be very important in someone like my eyes, because it gives me some sort of faith that, well, if we're going to be making these decisions, at least what we're trying to get done is getting done. And it's not just pallets of cash, like a lot of people like to say about Obama, how he floated pallets of cash out to the Taliban, to many places across the Middle East, and essentially was just bribing people not to be mean to the United States. If we can avoid that, start cleaning that up, I think you do start to see some very significant changes in the federal budget going in year after year. Now, I know it had been mentioned that by someone like a Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, making it clear that they actually run a profit as a state and they're paying down state debt. We can get to that point in the United States federally. We're starting to pay down these massive debt numbers that, you can still go look at the debt clock just climbing and climbing and climbing. If we could start to peel that back, we could actually start making some payments on some debt. That makes me think that we're starting to be financially responsible and maybe heading in a different direction than the Western Empire of Rome that fell. Now, that does not mean that we can neglect our duties here. One of the important facts, I know a pretty famous conservative talking show host goes by the name of Matt Walsh. You may have heard of him. He has done now 2 documentaries that were pretty fascinating. One being Am I Racist? And the other being What is a Woman? He came out, and again, he's very conservative and pretty popular on the right. What he came out and said is that he's not in favor of any U.S. aid at all. Doesn't really matter if you're talking about something like the U.S. aid or something like military aid going to our allies like Israel, Ukraine. And to a certain degree, I actually agree with the point. However, there is something to be said, and I do want to say it here, and that is you cannot neglect, as the power that we have grown to be in the United States, you cannot neglect not only the money spent, because sunk cost, something's not worth it, you just end it today. Understandable. However, if we are to totally get out, if we are no longer to support the EU, if we're no longer to support Israel whatsoever, how quickly would those entities get swallowed up by actors that we do not actually have a friendly relationship with? In my opinion, there is not a European nation that's strong enough to withhold a Russia encroaching upon them if we were out of the mix, if we were not giving arms, if we were not giving support. I do not see anybody who would be willing to stand up to Russia as a coalition. I really, really don't. And even as a singular state, let alone as a coalition. So being able to kind of be that foot that wedges the door in terms of getting slammed on us, I do think it's kind of important that we maintain some sort of diplomatic oversight, especially when we're watching so much of our money go out. Now, do I think that it needs to be cleaned up? Yes. Do I think that we need to ask more of our partners in the EU, someone like a Britain, someone like a Germany? Yeah, I think it's very important, because right now, as I see it, we're stretching ourselves very thin in terms of our ability to actually control the assets that we have laid out all across the earth, really. Military bases, again, allies, like a lot of this stuff costs a lot of money. And if we're just going to neglect that and walk away from all that, well, we're going to see some people that we really don't like gaining a lot of power geopolitically. I can't help but just see that as a negative. Now, we will see. Trump's first term hasn't even hit 100 days yet, so it's going to be pretty important what gets done in that 100 days. We all know that he is they like to call it lame duck president at this point. If that's the case, then again, these first 100 days are going to be massively impactful in terms of can he actually affect change. You're already seeing massive cultural changes being undertaken. Whether they're actually going to go all the way through or not is another question. But you're seeing a lot of deportations happening. You're seeing a lot of people getting rounded up by ICE. You're seeing a massive change. He just signed into law here another executive action, as we were talking about before, being taken on women's sports, which I think is extremely beneficial to the cultural healing of the United States. That's not to say that I am a hater of the LGBTQ community. I know by this point that acronym is outdated, but I don't really care. The whole point being is that we shouldn't really have to care. We as the people, there are a certain set of norms and a certain set of standards and cultural identities that have been kind of whitewashed over the last really about 20 years, 25 years. And in order to reverse that, you do need to set some standards. And I think one of the best standards to be set would be women's sports. Again, women deserve to be competing against women. If we're going to have women's sports, it needs to be an integral part of having a women's sport is that you have to be a biological woman in order to compete. There is just too much of a physical advantage being given if you are a man being able to compete. It doesn't matter what surgeries you've had, doesn't matter how much estrogen you've taken, doesn't matter how much testosterone, that you have in your body. There is a clear competitive advantage. And I think culturally, it's very important to get back to a place of common sense almost. Understanding that every woman has the opportunity to compete in a men's sport anytime they want. That is not the problem. The problem is the other way around. And the reason that it's a problem the other way around is because biologically speaking, we know that there is a disadvantage when it comes to physical sports being dominated by trans athletes. Doesn't matter if it's one, doesn't matter if it's 400, doesn't matter if it's thousands. Just one affects everybody on that person's team, everybody on the staff, that the way that they have to treat them, and it affects everybody that they compete with. I'll allude to a little bit of a personal anecdote again, because this is the way that I started being aware of trans issues. It was in high school, and this is going back quite a bit now. We're in 2025. This would have been in 2017 and 2018. I had a transgender female who turned male and was in my locker room. Now, again, my issue would have never been with her competing with us, but my issue did reside in the cultural aspect of putting a girl in the boys' locker room. It made everybody uneasy. It actually made the teacher get up and leave and basically not oversee anything in the locker room, which is dangerous in and of itself. A lot of bullying occurs in locker rooms generally, let alone when you have a transgender student. Now, I didn't witness any bullying per se to this individual, but that was because a lot of us were made out to be very uncomfortable. And when I'd approached the issue and gone up the chain and even ended up talking to the vice principal, I believe at the time, I was told to back off, not to confront this issue because I will be starting too big of a fight. Now, the way that I see it, it should have been handled much better. That person maybe should have been given their own changing space, not to make any of the girls uncomfortable with having a now self-acclaimed boy in the locker room, or vice versa, making any of the boys or the male teachers uncomfortable by having to oversee this. It makes everybody uncomfortable. And if you're not going to be honest about the amount of people that it impacts, then I think you're trying to win brownie points. So again, that might be a little bit of a win here in terms of trying to save our culture, save our country. And everybody here, if you have followed me enough, or if you've made it this far into the episode, you probably know that I've been pretty critical of Trump, but I've been pretty critical of Trump for quite a bit now. These first few weeks have given some hope. Other than the plane crashes, of course, which are devastating, there's been a lot of positives to look out for in terms of, a very quick and swift trade war with Mexico in order to get them to buy into overseeing the border, which is something that has not been done. It's always been our side that has to deal with the entirety of oversight on the border, and that's just not fair to us. Doing the same with Canada, floating out ideas like that may seem crazy, something like buying a Greenland, but actually seeing the strategic benefit and the honest fact that the Netherlands really doesn't have a lot of economic interest in owning something like a Greenland anymore. Some of these crazy far-fetched ideas may be a little bit better of ideas than we all think, and maybe we need to allow, and I'm talking specifically to myself here, allow Trump some time to play out his thoughts and see if they actually are beneficial to the United States. Some of the biggest things that we look back on and comparing as we close out this episode here, comparing Rome and comparing the United States, is that although maybe a lot of people like the direction that we're going in, maybe a lot of people don't like the direction that we're going in. Something to be on the lookout for is this swallowing up of power by the executive branch of the United States. If there is to be this, say, this precedent set that all action needs to be taken by the executive and essentially Congress is null and void, maybe the judiciary is getting packed so that it's just an extended arm of the executive branch, which is what a lot of people would argue now with Trump having so much influence on the court. This is where I think we may be running into some hot water. Again, maybe it's not a problem now. Maybe Donald Trump has his wits with him and he can do this thing. He's only got 4 years, doesn't have a full 8. So, maybe things will work out, and that's fair and true. But if we start seeing this slide towards a autocratic government, one being ruled by one person, what I fear is that you have this notion of essentially monarchy being passed down hereditarily, passing down the torch of power. And maybe it's not just directly hereditary. Again, I've mentioned a couple of times, and I don't have exact examples, but I know that this happened. So go look into the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan to get a little bit more in detail, or go check out some books. There were times where emperors would essentially kill their own sons, knowing that their son was not up for the task, or would send them off somewhere where they couldn't be a great actor when they died. And you just get into some really dirty politics when you start removing, not going to say democracy, removing the ability to form a republic as we have in the United States, removing the checks and balances, essentially taking away the power of something like a legislative branch and making something like a judiciary null and void because you pack the court with people that think the way that you think. When I say you, I'm talking about the President of the United States. This is some things that we're going to have to be looking out for. What's going to be prepared now is, as long as JD Vance doesn't really make any big boo-boos, more than likely what's going to happen is Trump is going to be pushing for him to take over directly after his exit here, which would be in 2029 will be the inducting of the next president. You're going to think that probably JD Vance is going to be pushed. And this is where I think we're going to have to start paying a lot of attention, because if you have a continuation of Trump's policy going for 8 years after Trump is out, and then JD Vance tries to do the same thing with another Republican in 12 years from now, this is where I think we start heading down the path of true empire, of emperors trying to pass the torch to people that they see might run things in their eyes the best. And this is where I think the problems will come. So to wrap up the episode today, I do not think that the United States is at this point in time in a downfall. However, I do think that we're at a turning point. I think we can allude to a couple of different things that I pointed out today. Both the number of executive actions that have been being taken by recent presidents has gone up significantly, especially when you're talking about the two most recent terms of presidents being Donald Trump's first term and Joe Biden's one term. And then you look at the spending and just how much that federal spending, that federal budget has increased over the last really 25 to 30 years or so, maybe even dating back to Reagan, how much we've increased the federal spending per year and per term of president. If we can't get on a bit of a corrective course there, I would say this is the turning point. If we don't see, better spending numbers coming out after this 4-year term of Donald Trump, God willing, he makes it through. If we don't see a little bit more power delegated back to the legislative and trust in the judiciary, that no matter who is elected as a judge, that judge is going to be ruling based on the Constitution of the United States and not off of whims or political flows that seemingly the court has been following as of recent. And you see that somebody was appointed by a conservative, generally speaking, they're going to rule conservative. When one side or another of an issue is leaning towards their side, they're almost always going to vote for it. And I think we would be much better off as American citizens if that was not the case. So we will see. We will have to, again, wait and see our due diligence to not jump on the bandwagon every single time something is done that either we love or that we hate. Because at the end of the day, Donald Trump is one of the only presidents that I have borne witness to changing his mind, going back on enacting policy. It's going to be very important with people down the road that things don't continue in the spiral that has become very normalized, again, over the last about 25 to 30 years, and maybe even going back a little bit longer. Now, to totally close out the show today, I'm done talking politics, done talking this stuff. Not for the next show, because I am going to be bringing it back up. But our next show is going to be show number 100. It's pretty special to me, pretty special to us here at We The Patriots, and I think it is going to be a little bit of a fun show. I'm going to be talking a little bit about government efficiency, talking about the Doge, talking about the more wild theories that I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier at the end of this show, and hopefully we can have fun with it. And I just want to thank you all for sticking around, for if you made it all the way into this deep in the podcast. Thank you. And not only that, if you made it 100 episodes and you watched every single one of them, well, bravo to you. It's been a ride. And to be honest, the fact that we're starting to gain some traction, gain some pretty consistent followers here on YouTube and Spotify and on my Instagram, I just can't be more thankful. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sal Assante with We The Patriots podcast, and I will catch you guys on Friday this time. I promise you that we will have 2 episodes this week, and episode number 100 will be this Friday. Thank you.
I wish I would have fucking stayed. I want to be something, not nothing. Trapped inside my dream and I'm running away from these demons. But the feeling's so good, I'ma keep dreaming.